A stack of bills hit the auction table so hard the coins on top bounced off and rolled onto the floor. Grown men turned around and laughed. One man spit on the ground and shook his head. A woman covered her mouth to hide a smirk. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence and just stared down at the counter. $2,541. In small, folded, sweaty bills, counted out slowly by a kid barely tall enough to see over the table. His boots were caked in mud. His hands were shaking, but his eyes never once left the auctioneer's face. 13-year-old Eli Grant had just bought 60 acres of dead, cracked farmland that every adult in that room had already walked away from. What none of them knew yet was buried 6 feet under that worthless dirt. Stay with me on this one. The laughing didn't stop until Eli folded up the receipt and walked out of that auction house like he'd just bought a truck instead of a pile of dirt. Nobody offered to shake his hand. Nobody said congratulations. One man muttered, "Boy just flushed $2,000 down a hole," loud enough for half the room to hear. Eli didn't answer. He just kept walking. The next morning, he rode out to the land on the back of a borrowed mule, and he walked every row of it himself. 60 acres. Cracked dirt, gray and hard, like the ground had given up trying. No crops. No water worth mentioning. A collapsed fence line on the east side. An old shed leaning so bad it looked like the next strong wind would finish it off. He counted rows out of habit. His father had taught him that. Count the rows, count the yield, count the mouths you got to feed. Except there was no yield here. Just dirt. And the mouths back home weren't going anywhere. There was his mother, stretching a sack of flour and a pot of beans further than any sack of flour and pot of beans had a right to go. There were his 2 little sisters, 6 and 9, who didn't understand why supper kept getting thinner. And there was his father, laid up in bed for going on 4 months now, coughing so hard some nights the whole house heard it through the walls. Doc Whitfield had a name for it. Consumption. He said rest might help. Rest didn't put food on the table, and it sure didn't make the note at First Trust go away. That note was the real farm. 40 acres their family had worked for 3 generations, sitting on the good side of the county with real soil and a real well. The bank had given them until harvest to pay what was owed, or they'd lose it. Eli had heard his mother and father talking low in the kitchen after the girls went to sleep, the kind of talking that stops the second a floorboard creaks. So when Eli stood in that auction house with every dollar he'd saved doing odd jobs since he was 10 years old, mucking stalls and hauling feed and fixing fences for half of the county, he wasn't buying land because he had money to burn. He didn't have a spare nickel to burn. He was buying it because of something old Mr. Hutchins told him 2 summers back, sitting on his porch with a jar of buttermilk, talking the way old men talk when they think nobody's really listening. Hutchins had worked that land as a hired hand back before Eli was born. He said the man who owned it before, a prospector named Silas Reed, used to walk the north pasture at night with a lantern, muttering to himself, digging little test holes nobody ever saw the purpose of. Then one year Silas Reed just disappeared, left everything behind. The land sat empty so long the county finally put it up for sale, and everybody who'd ever worked it swore up and down there wasn't a thing worth having on it. Hutchins didn't. He just squinted out at the tree line and said, "That ground's hiding something, boy." Old Silas wasn't digging holes for the fun of it. Eli had carried that sentence around in his head for 2 years like a stone in his pocket. Now he stood on the same dead dirt Hutchins had talked about, and instead of seeing 60 acres of nothing, he saw 60 acres of maybe. He spent that whole first day walking it end to end, kicking at hard clumps of dirt, checking where the ground dipped and where it didn't. Toward evening, he came up on the collapsed shed near the north fence line. Most of the roof had caved in years back. The walls leaned in on each other like 2 drunks holding each other up. He figured there might be tools worth salvaging in there. His family needed every tool they could get their hands on. He pulled aside broken boards, careful of nails, careful of rot. Underneath a pile of collapsed shelving, one section of the floor looked wrong, not rotted through like the rest. Cut. On purpose. Like somebody had sawed a square hatch into the floorboards a long time ago and covered it back over with dust and years. Eli knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the wood. It gave, just a little, right where a normal floor never should. He looked back over his shoulder, out toward the road, out toward town, out toward every man who'd laughed at him the day before. Then he pried up the first board. The board cracked loose easier than Eli expected. Dust came up in a cloud thick enough to make him cough. He set the board aside and pried up the next one, then the next, working his fingers raw until he'd opened a square hole about 2 feet wide. Underneath sat a tin box. It was rusted brown and orange, the size of a bread loaf, wedged tight between 2 support beams like somebody had shoved it down there and packed dirt around it on purpose. A busted padlock hung off the front, the metal eaten through with rust, one good pull away from falling apart completely. Eli didn't move for a second. He just knelt there staring at it the way a man stares at a rattlesnake he didn't expect to find under a porch step. Then he reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it down on the shed floor and worked the padlock with both hands, twisting until the rusted metal gave way and the lock snapped clean off. The lid stuck. He had to dig his fingers under the edge and pry until it popped open with a groan. Inside was a folded piece of leather, cracked and stiff with age, and underneath that, a small book bound in the same kind of leather, the cover curled up at the corners. Eli unfolded the leather sheet first. It was a map, hand-drawn, ink faded to brown, lines marking out what looked like the same 60 acres he'd walked that morning. Little X marks were scattered across the north end of the property, and one X was circled twice, heavier than the rest, like somebody had gone back over it again and again, pressing hard enough to nearly tear through the leather. He picked up the little book next. The pages were brittle. Some of them stuck together, but the handwriting was clear enough once his eyes adjusted to the fading ink. The first page had a name written across the top. Silas Reed, 1887. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He sat down right there on the shed floor, dust and rot all around him, and he read. Silas Reed had written pages and pages about the ground, about test holes he'd dug across the property, about samples he'd chipped loose and studied by lamplight. Most of the early pages were just numbers and notes Eli couldn't make sense of. But near the back, the writing changed. It got faster, messier, like the man had been in a hurry, or scared, or both. One line was underlined twice. Vein runs under the north pasture, following the dry creek bed toward the split oak. Rock breaks strange there. Color's not right for common stone. Told no one. Will not tell the bank. Will not tell the county. Will not tell a living soul until I know what I'm sitting on. Eli read that line 3 times. He knew the split oak. Everybody who'd ever walked that land knew the split oak, the old tree near the north fence that had been struck by lightning so long ago it grew up in 2 separate trunks instead of one. He'd walked right past it that morning without thinking twice. He closed the journal and sat there a long moment, the tin box open in his lap, the light outside the shed turning orange as the sun dropped low. Then he stood up, tucked the map and the journal inside his shirt, and walked the 1/4 mile out to the split oak with his heart going harder than it had any right to go for a boy just looking at dirt. He didn't dig that night. He didn't have a shovel with him, and it was getting dark, and his mother would worry if he didn't get the mule back before full dark set in. But he stood there under that split oak a long time, looking at the dry creek bed running past it, matching it up in his head against the lines on that map. It matched close enough to make his hands shake. He came back 3 nights later, after his family was asleep, after he'd told his mother he couldn't sleep and was going to walk off some restlessness. He carried a shovel and a pickaxe he'd borrowed without asking from a neighbor's barn, and he walked the whole 1/4 mile out to the split oak under a half moon, alone. He dug for hours. His palms blistered through what was left of his calluses. He hit rock twice and had to shift his hole a few feet each time. Somewhere past midnight, arms shaking, about ready to give up and try again some other night, his shovel rang out against something that wasn't dirt and wasn't ordinary rock. He dropped to his knees and dug with his hands. A chunk of stone broke free from the packed earth, heavier than it had any right to be for its size, streaked through with a color Eli had never seen in any rock on that farm or any other. Dark, almost purple in the moonlight, with veins running through it that caught what little light there was and threw it back strange. He turned it over in his hands for a long time. Then he filled the hole back in, packed the dirt down flat, and walked home with the rock wrapped in his shirt and his heart pounding the whole way. He hid it under his mattress before he lay down, and he didn't sleep more than an hour that whole night. Word travels quiet in a small county, but it travels. By morning, 2 different neighbors had already mentioned to his mother that somebody'd seen movement out on the old Reed land after dark. Eli heard it through the kitchen window while he was feeding the chickens, and his stomach dropped clean through the floor. But nothing came of it. No wagon rolled up the road. No sheriff, no banker, no neighbor with questions. He did his chores same as every morning, hauled water, split kindling, ate a breakfast of beans and cold cornbread with his sisters laughing about something at the table, his mother humming while she worked the stove, his father managing to sit up for a few minutes and eat on his own. By noon, Eli almost let himself believe he'd gotten away with it clean. By noon, Eli almost let himself believe he'd gotten away with it clean. Then a wagon rattled up the drive right in the middle of dinner, and the man driving it wasn't wearing farm clothes. He wore a gray suit, city cut, dust on the hem from the road, but nothing on him that said he'd ever swung a hoe in his life. He climbed down slow, looked over the Grant place like he was pricing it, and asked for the man of the house. Eli's mother told him Mr. Grant wasn't well. The stranger said that was fine. He'd talk to whoever handled the family's business, and his eyes landed on Eli standing in the doorway with a fork still in his hand. His name was Harmon Reyes. He said he worked for a mineral survey outfit out of the county seat, and that word had reached him somebody'd been seen digging out past the old Reed property line after dark. He asked, real polite, whether Eli knew anything about that. Eli said no, sir, and his voice came out steadier than his stomach felt. Reyes looked at him a long moment, the kind of look a man gives when he's deciding whether a lie is worth calling out right then or saving for later. Then he tipped his hat, said he'd be around the county a few more days doing survey work, and climbed back up onto his wagon. He didn't leave right away, though. He looked out past the barn, toward the north fence line, toward the split oak sitting there in plain sight. That was the trigger, and once Eli understood what it meant, everything about this shifted. This wasn't a rumor anymore, something Hutchins whispered on a porch 2 summers back. This was a grown man in a city suit, asking direct questions, knowing exactly which corner of that dead land to stare at. Somebody besides Eli already had an interest in the Reed property, and that somebody had money and men who worked for them, and no reason at all to care about a 13-year-old boy standing in their way. Eli didn't sleep that night either. The next morning he made a decision that scared him more than digging alone in the dark ever had. He wrapped the ore sample in a rag, tucked it under his shirt, and rode the mule into town, straight to Deacon Whitlow's blacksmith shop, the one place in the county where a man might know rock from ordinary stone. Whitlow was an old hand, gruff, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from 40 years at the forge. Eli told him he'd found the rock walking the fields and just wanted to know what it was. Wasn't a full lie. Wasn't the truth either. Whitlow turned that chunk of stone over under a lamp for a long time. He scratched at it with a file. He weighed it in his palm like he was weighing a bag of coin. Then he looked up at Eli with an expression the boy had never seen on a grown man's face before. Something between hunger and fear. "Boy," he said, "where exactly did you say you found this?" Eli didn't answer straight. Whitlow set the rock down slow, like it might go off. "This here's got silver run clean through it. And something else besides, something I ain't got the eye to name for certain. But I've handled enough ore in my life to know this ain't a common find. This is the kind of rock men kill each other over." The word fortune didn't get said out loud. It didn't need to be. That right there was the first real payoff of this whole story. A 13-year-old boy, laughed out of an auction house 2 days before, was standing in a blacksmith shop holding proof that the dead dirt he bought for $2,541 was sitting on something worth more money than most men in that county would see in 10 lifetimes. If you're still with me, this is exactly the kind of story worth sticking around for. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next to this boy is going to test him harder than anything so far. Whitlow swore he'd keep quiet. Whitlow was a man of his word, mostly. But a blacksmith shop isn't a private place, and his apprentice had been standing at the back of the room the whole time, pretending to sweep, listening to every word. By evening, the story had legs. Not the whole truth, not yet, but enough. A boy found something valuable out on the old Reed land. And in a county that small, a rumor like that moves faster than any horse. It reached Harmon Reyes before the sun went down. He came back to the Grant farm the next morning. Only this time he wasn't alone, and he wasn't asking polite questions anymore. He had a second man with him, older, heavier, carrying himself like a man used to being obeyed. He introduced himself as representing a company with interests in mineral rights across 3 counties, and he made Eli an offer right there in the front yard, in front of his mother, in front of his sick father propped up in the doorway listening. $600. Cash. For land Eli had paid $2,541 for 3 days earlier. When Eli said no, the older man's face didn't change much, but his voice dropped a register. He mentioned, almost gentle, that a 13-year-old buying land at auction was a legal gray area worth looking into. He mentioned that contracts signed by minors got challenged in court all the time. He mentioned that a family already behind on a bank note might want to think real careful about who they made enemies of. Then he tipped his hat, same as Reyes had, and the two of them rode off down the same dirt road every laughing man had walked down 3 days before. Eli stood in the yard a long time after the dust settled, his mother's hand tight on his shoulder, his father's eyes on him from the doorway. This wasn't about pride anymore. This wasn't about proving a room full of grown men wrong. This was about keeping what he'd bought before somebody with money and lawyers found a way to take it from him. Eli didn't wait around to see what came next. 2 days after the offer in the yard, he rode into the county seat and walked straight into the office of Judge Pruitt, the only man in that county both sides trusted enough to fear. He brought the receipt from the auction. He brought the deed, signed and stamped by the county clerk the same afternoon he bought the land. He brought his mother, because a 13-year-old walking in alone might get waved off, but a 13-year-old with his mother standing behind him got a chair and a cup of coffee he didn't touch. Judge Pruitt read the deed twice. He asked Eli straight out if he understood what he'd signed. Eli said yes, sir. He asked if anybody forced him, tricked him, or signed for him. Eli said no, sir. He'd counted out every dollar himself. Pruitt set the papers down and said the sale was clean. A minor could hold property in that county so long as a parent or guardian didn't contest it, and nobody in that room was contesting anything. He said if any company came around threatening otherwise, they could take it up with him personally. That was one fire put out. It wasn't the last. 3 nights later, Eli woke to the smell of smoke. Not the house. The old shed, the one he'd pulled the tin box out from under, was burning fast against the dark, flames climbing what was left of the roof and throwing orange light clear across the north pasture. Eli ran barefoot across cold dirt, his father's old shotgun in his hands before he even remembered picking it up. By the time he got close enough to feel the heat, 2 men were already riding off from the tree line, not bothering to hide that they'd been there. He didn't get a clean look at faces. He didn't need to. Nobody in that county burned a shed for no reason, and nobody had reason but the men who'd tried to buy him out and got told no. His mother came running with a bucket. His father, coughing so hard he could barely stand, made it as far as the porch rail and held onto it with both hands, watching his son fight a fire mostly alone in the dark. They lost the shed. There was nothing left to save by the time the flames burned down. But the fire hadn't touched the split oak, and it hadn't touched the ground beneath it, and Eli understood exactly what message that fire was meant to send. Get scared. Get small. Sell. He didn't sell. The next morning, Eli did something that surprised even himself. He rode to Deacon Whitlow's shop and asked for one more favor. He wanted Whitlow to write up, in his own hand, everything he'd said about that and he wanted the name of a real assayer, a licensed one, out of the capital, who could put an official number on what was sitting under that north pasture. Whitlow didn't ask questions this time. He just wrote the letter. It took 8 days for the assayer to arrive by train and by wagon, an older man in spectacles who barely said 2 words the whole ride out. He took samples from 3 different spots along the dry creek bed, chipped loose with his own hammer, and packed them careful in cloth like they were made of glass. He came back to the Grant kitchen table 2 nights later with numbers written out neat on a folded sheet. Silver, high grade, running in a vein that by his rough estimate stretched a good 100 yards under the north pasture. He said outright, no hedging, that a claim like that could be worth more than every farm in the county combined. Word of an official assay travels faster than any rumor ever could. By the following week, half the county knew a real number, not a whisper, and the men who'd laughed loudest at that auction table went quiet fast. Harmon Reyes came back one final time. He came alone this time, no hired man beside him, no offer folded up in his coat. He stood in the yard where he'd stood twice before and told Eli, flat, that his company was prepared to make a fair offer for mineral rights, a real one, with lawyers and paperwork done proper, no threats attached. Eli looked at him a long moment. Then he said the same thing he'd said the first time, only steadier now, backed by a judge's word and an assayer's number and a whole county watching. No, he said if anybody wanted a piece of that vein, they'd deal with him direct, on terms he set, with a lawyer of his own choosing sitting at the table. Not $600 in a yard. Not veiled talk about minors and gray areas. A fair contract or nothing at all. Reyes stood there a good while, jaw tight, looking at a boy who 3 weeks earlier couldn't get a grown man in that county to shake his hand. Then he nodded once, climbed back onto his wagon, and this time when he rode off, he didn't look back at the split oak at all. The fight wasn't finished. Contracts still had to get written, terms still had to get argued, lawyers still had to earn their pay. But something had shifted for good in that yard, and everybody standing in it felt it. The boy who bought dead dirt for $2,541 had just made a mining company back down without raising his voice once. The contract took most of a month to finish. Eli sat through every meeting his lawyer set up, a young attorney out of the county seat named Thomas Cade, hired with money Whitlow helped him borrow against the promise of what was coming. Eli didn't say much in those meetings. He listened. He asked questions when something didn't make sense to him, and he made Cade explain it again until it did. When the ink finally dried, the terms were plain. The mining company got the rights to work the vein under the north pasture. Eli kept ownership of every acre, kept a share of everything pulled out of the ground, and kept final say over how the work got done on his land. No $600 in a yard. A real number, one that made the county clerk read it twice when it got filed. The first payment came in before winter set in. Eli walked into First Trust with his mother beside him and paid off the note on the family's 40 acres in full. The banker who'd signed that note, the same man who'd sat across from his father a dozen times shaking his head about deadlines, counted out the payment slow, like he wanted to make sure it was real. He didn't laugh this time. Nobody in that bank laughed. His father's health didn't turn around overnight. Consumption doesn't work that way. But there was money now for a real doctor out of the capital, for medicine that wasn't just rest and hope, for a winter with enough wood and enough food that his body had something to fight with. By spring, he was walking the porch on his own most mornings. By summer, he was walking as far as the barn. His mother stopped stretching flour and beans. She still did it out of habit some nights, and Eli never said anything about it, because some habits a person earns the right to keep. His sisters got new boots before the year was out, the kind that fit instead of the kind passed down twice already. Eli remembered the day his mother handed them over, how the youngest one just stared at her feet for a full minute before she said anything. The old shed never got rebuilt. Eli left the burned ground the way it was, black and empty, a reminder he didn't need, but kept anyway. He built a new one closer to the house instead, and he made sure the floor was solid all the way through this time. No hollow spots, no secrets. He kept the tin box. It sat on a shelf in his room for years afterward. Empty now, the map and the journal moved to a drawer where he could get to them whenever he wanted to read Silas Reed's handwriting again. He never did find out what happened to the man. Nobody ever did. Some folks in the county said he ran off scared of what he found. Others said the ground took him the same way it nearly took Eli's family's whole future, just in a different direction. Eli didn't spend much time wondering. A man who vanishes without a word leaves a question nobody gets to answer, and Eli had learned by then that some questions just stay open. The county changed the way it talked about him, slow at first, then all at once. Men who'd muttered about a boy flushing $2,000 down a hole started calling him Mr. Grant, even though he was still 13, then 14, then 15 before anybody quite noticed the years passing. Harmon Reyes came around twice more over the following years, always on business, always polite, always dealing straight. Eli never held the yard against him. Business was business, and Reyes had backed off when backing off was the right move. Deacon Whitlow got a share of the work too, forging tools and fittings for the mining crew once operations got going proper. He liked to tell the story to anybody who'd sit still long enough to hear it. How a boy walked into his shop with a rock wrapped in a rag and asked an honest question, and how he'd known right then he was holding something that was going to change a family's whole life. Eli didn't tell the story much himself. He didn't need to. The land told it for him. Every time somebody drove past the north pasture and saw the work going on where dead dirt used to sit. Years later, long after the mining company had come and gone and the vein had given up most of what it had to give, Eli stood at that same auction house one more time. Older now, there to bid on a piece of land for somebody else's benefit, a neighbor down on his luck the way his own family once was. Somebody in the back of the room, new to the county, leaned over and asked who that man was, the one everybody seemed to know. An old-timer near the front, one of the men who'd laughed loudest all those years back, answered without even turning around. "That's Eli Grant," he said. "Bought 60 acres of dead dirt for $2,541 once, and every fool in this room laughed him right out the door." He paused a second, like he still couldn't quite believe it himself. Turned out we were the fools. Nobody laughed at that. Eli just nodded to the auctioneer, same as he always had, and got down to business.